The thermometer outside Harold Jameson's kitchen window read -23 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was only getting colder. The winter of 2014 had descended on rural Michigan with a vengeance that nobody had seen coming, not even the weathermen who'd spent decades watching the Great Lakes freeze over. By mid-January, the entire Midwest was locked in what meteorologists were calling a polar vortex, a term that sounded more like science fiction than the brutal reality facing millions of Americans. Power grids were failing across 3 states. Natural gas supplies were running dangerously low. And in the small farming community of Hickory Ridge, population 847, people were starting to panic. But 78-year-old Harold Jameson wasn't panicking, while his neighbors were huddling around their failing furnaces, layering on every piece of clothing they owned, and seriously considering whether they should evacuate to emergency shelters 30 miles away. Harold was sitting in his living room in a flannel shirt and jeans, completely comfortable, reading yesterday's newspaper by the warm glow of something nobody else in town could quite understand. If you're enjoying this story and want to see where it goes, do me a favor and leave a comment below telling me what temperature it is, where you're watching this from. I'm curious to know if any of you are dealing with extreme weather right now, and I read every single comment. It really helps me know what kind of stories resonate with you. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. Harold had lived in the same 2-story farmhouse for 56 years, ever since he'd married his late wife Martha back in 1958. The house itself was even older, built in 1923 by Martha's grandfather, a stern German immigrant named Otto Schultz, who'd come to America with nothing but a trunk of clothes and a head full of old-world knowledge that most Americans had long forgotten. The house sat on 40 acres of land that Harold had stopped actively farming 15 years ago, though he still kept a large vegetable garden every summer and a small chicken coop that provided him with fresh eggs year-round. The town of Hickory Ridge had always been the kind of place where people knew each other's business, where you didn't need to lock your doors, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the Friday night high school football games. But that January, as the temperature continued to plummet and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below zero, the town's usual sense of community cohesion was being tested in ways nobody had anticipated. The crisis had started 3 days earlier, when the power had gone out across the entire county. The electric company said it was due to equipment failure caused by the extreme cold, ice accumulation on power lines, and unprecedented demand on the system. They estimated it would take at least a week to get everything back online, maybe longer. For most people, that meant no heat, no light, and no way to cook food except on gas stoves if they were lucky enough to have them. But the natural gas supply was also becoming problematic. The utility company had issued warnings about conservation, and there were rumors that they might have to start implementing rolling shutdowns to preserve what was left in the reserve tanks. Harold's nearest neighbor, Tom Patterson, had knocked on his door that first night after the power went out. Tom was 62, a retired postal worker who lived alone in a ranch-style house about a quarter-mile down the road. He'd come over wearing 3 jackets, 2 pairs of pants, and a ski mask, looking like he was preparing to summit Everest rather than walk a few hundred yards. "Harold, you doing okay over here?" Tom had asked, his breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. "I got a portable generator running at my place, but I can only keep it going a few hours a day. Gas is getting expensive, and I don't know how long this is going to last." Harold had invited him inside, and Tom's eyes had widened the moment he stepped through the door. The house was genuinely warm, not just tolerable, but actually comfortable. Tom pulled off his ski mask and stared around the living room like he'd just walked into a parallel universe where the laws of thermodynamics didn't apply. "How are you doing this?" Tom had asked, his voice filled with confusion and a touch of suspicion. "You got a generator I don't know about? Some kind of propane heater?" Harold had smiled, that quiet smile of a man who knows something valuable that others have forgotten. "No generator, Tom. No propane either. Come on, I'll show you." He'd led Tom through the living room and into the dining room, and that's when Tom saw it. Taking up nearly the entire eastern wall of the dining room was a massive structure made of brick and stone, easily 10 feet wide and reaching from floor to ceiling. It looked like something out of a medieval castle, or maybe a historical museum display about colonial America. At its base was a large firebox with a heavy iron door, currently glowing with the warm light of burning wood. But unlike a regular fireplace, this structure had multiple chambers, channels, and what appeared to be a series of carefully designed passages that zigzagged up through the brickwork. "What in God's name is that?" Tom had asked. "It's called a masonry heater," Harold explained, running his hand along the warm brick surface with obvious affection. "Some people call it a Russian fireplace or a Finnish contraflow stove. This particular design is based on plans from 1947, drawn up by a Finnish engineer who emigrated to Minnesota after the war. Martha's father got the plans from him and built this thing himself in 1952, right after we got married and moved into this house." Tom had stepped closer, feeling the heat radiating from the structure. It wasn't the sharp, intense heat of a regular fireplace that felt too hot up close and disappeared the moment you stepped away. This was different, a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to fill the entire room evenly. "I've never seen anything like this," Tom admitted. "How does it work?" Harold had launched into an explanation that was clearly something he'd given before, probably many times over the years. The basic principle was simple but ingenious. Unlike a conventional fireplace that sent most of its heat straight up the chimney, wasting perhaps 80% of the energy from the burning wood, a masonry heater was designed to capture and store that heat in its massive thermal mass. When you built a fire in the firebox, which only needed to be done once or twice a day, the hot gases from the combustion were forced to travel through a long, winding path of internal channels before they finally exited through the chimney. As they traveled through these channels, they transferred their heat to the surrounding brickwork and stone. The masonry would absorb this heat and then radiate it slowly and steadily into the living space for the next 12 to 24 hours. "You only burn a fire for about 2 hours, Harold explained. "You get it burning hot and fast, which actually produces very little smoke because the wood combusts so completely. All that heat gets absorbed into the bricks, probably around 2 tons of brick and stone in this whole structure. Then the bricks act like a giant radiator, giving off heat for the rest of the day and through the night. By morning, the bricks are still warm to the touch and I build another fire." Tom had stood there processing this information, his engineer's mind trying to grasp why he'd never heard of such a thing before. If this is so effective, why doesn't everyone have one? Why did we all go to forced air furnaces and baseboard heaters? Harold had shrugged. Progress, I guess. Or what people thought was progress. After World War II, America was booming. Oil and natural gas were cheap. Electric companies were building power plants everywhere. The idea of spending weeks building something like this out of brick and stone, when you could just install a furnace in a couple of days, seemed old-fashioned, backward. My father-in-law was called crazy for building this thing. People laughed at him, said he was wasting his time and money on old-world nonsense when modern heating systems were so much more convenient. "But it works," Tom said, stating the obvious. "It works," Harold confirmed. "And it keeps working when the power goes out, when the gas supply fails, when everything else modern people depend on stops functioning. All I need is firewood. And I've got 40 acres of mixed hardwood that I've been managing sustainably for decades. I could heat this house for the rest of my life and never run out of fuel." Word had spread quickly through Hickory Ridge after that first night. Tom had told his sister, who told her husband, who mentioned it at the emergency town meeting that was held the next day in the community center, which was running on a backup generator that was rapidly depleting the town's emergency fuel reserve. Within 48 hours, Harold's house had become something of a local legend, and also a source of considerable controversy. Some people were genuinely curious and wanted to learn more about this forgotten technology. Others were skeptical, convinced there must be some trick or some modern convenience Harold wasn't admitting to. And still others were resentful, interpreting Harold's self-sufficiency as a kind of judgment on their own dependence on modern systems. Even though Harold had never said a word to suggest such a thing, the mayor, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who ran the local hardware store when she wasn't dealing with municipal politics, had come to visit Harold personally on the 4th day of the crisis. She'd arrived in the late afternoon, driving her truck slowly down the snow-packed driveway, and Harold had watched her approach with the patient resignation of a man who'd been expecting this visit sooner or later. "Harold," she'd said, getting straight to the point after the minimum required pleasantries, "we've got a real situation developing in town. The elementary school has been converted into an emergency shelter, but we can't keep running the generators indefinitely. We're burning through fuel faster than we can get deliveries, and the roads are so bad that the tanker trucks are having trouble getting through. I've got elderly people, families with small children, and the temperature keeps dropping. Some folks are starting to talk about you and this heater of yours." Harold had nodded slowly. "I figured they might be." "There's two ways this conversation could go," Patricia continued. "Either you're willing to help educate people about this technology, maybe help us figure out if there's any way to implement something similar on a larger scale, or you're going to become the target of a lot of frustration from scared people who can't understand why you're comfortable while they're suffering." It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't far from one either. Harold understood the subtext. In a crisis, the person who appears to have what others desperately need becomes either a hero or a villain, and the margin between those two outcomes can be razor thin. "I'll help however I can," Harold said. "But Patricia, you need to understand something. This isn't a quick fix. You can't just throw together a masonry heater overnight. It takes skill, planning, and proper materials. The knowledge of how to build these things has been mostly lost in this country. Even if I drew up the plans and explained the principles, most modern contractors wouldn't know where to start." Patricia had sat down heavily in one of Harold's kitchen chairs, the weight of leadership in a crisis evident in every line of her face. "Tell me what you know. Tell me everything. Because right now, Harold, old world knowledge doesn't sound backward at all. It sounds like exactly what we need." The kitchen table became command central for what Harold would later think of as the Great Education Project. Patricia had returned the next morning with 3 people. Robert Chen, a general contractor who'd built half the houses in the newer subdivision on the east side of town; Susan Martinez, who taught high school physics and had a background in engineering; and old Frank Kowalski, a retired mason who was 82 and hadn't laid brick in 15 years, but still had steady hands and sharp eyes. Harold had spread out the original 1947 blueprints on the table. The yellowed paper fragile with age, but the pencil lines still clear and precise. His father-in-law had kept them wrapped in oilcloth in a cedar chest, treating them with the reverence some people reserved for family Bibles. The plans were written partially in Finnish, with notes in the margins translated into English in his father-in-law's careful handwriting. "The first thing you need to understand," Harold began, his finger tracing the cross-sectional diagram of the heater's internal structure, "is that this isn't just a pile of bricks with fire inside. Every element serves a specific purpose. The firebox is designed to create extremely high temperatures between 1200 and 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, wood doesn't just burn, it practically vaporizes. Very little smoke, minimal creosote buildup, and almost complete combustion of the fuel." Robert leaned in closer, his contractor's eye taking in the details. "These channels here, the ones that snake up through the structure, what's the logic behind the pattern?" "Surface area and dwell time," Susan said before Harold could answer, her physics teacher instincts kicking in. "The hot gases need maximum contact with the masonry to transfer their heat. The longer path means more heat transfer before the exhaust exits." Harold nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. My father-in-law used to say that a regular fireplace is like trying to warm your hands by waving them past a candle flame. You feel something, but most of the heat escapes before you can capture it. This design traps that heat, forces it to give up its energy to the bricks before it's allowed to leave." Frank Kowalski had been silent up to this point, running his weathered hands over the diagrams with the focused attention of a man reading a language he'd spoken fluently in another life. "The mortar," he said finally, his voice rough from decades of smoking. "You can't use regular mortar for something that gets this hot. You need refractory cement, the kind they use in industrial kilns. And the bricks? They need to be fire brick in the combustion chamber and the first series of channels. Regular brick will crack and spall under that kind of thermal stress." "Can we get those materials?" Patricia asked, already anticipating problems. "And more importantly, can we get them now, in the middle of this crisis, with roads half closed and supply chains disrupted?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harold stood and walked to the masonry heater, pressing his palm flat against its surface. Even 4 hours after the morning fire had burned down, the bricks were still warm to the touch. still radiating their stored heat into the room. "The materials exist," he said slowly. "Frank's right about what we need. But here's the hard truth that nobody wants to hear. Even if we had everything sitting in a warehouse ready to go, even if we had a dozen skilled masons who knew what they were doing, we couldn't build one of these fast enough to help with the current emergency. A properly constructed masonry heater takes weeks. The mortar needs time to cure between courses. Rush it, and you risk structural failure or dangerous cracking that could lead to carbon monoxide leaking into the living space." "So what are you saying?" Patricia's voice had an edge of frustration. "That we just accept there's nothing we can do?" "I'm saying that this crisis is showing us the consequences of choices we made decades ago," Harold replied, his tone gentle but firm. After the war, America decided that convenience was more important than resilience. We chose systems that worked wonderfully as long as nothing went wrong, but failed catastrophically the moment something did. We can't undo those choices overnight. What we can do is start learning, start preparing for the next crisis, and start rebuilding the knowledge base that we let slip away. Robert had pulled out his phone, then remembered there was no cell service and the internet was down with the power. He laughed bitterly at himself. "I've built maybe 200 houses in my career, every single one dependent on electricity or natural gas for heat. Not one of them could keep a family warm right now without power. That's a sobering realization." The conversation had shifted then from immediate solutions to longer-term planning. Harold walked them through every aspect of the masonry heater's construction, from the foundation requirements to the specific dimensions of the firebox, the angles of the internal baffles, and the critical importance of the chimney draft. He explained how his father-in-law had built the entire structure over the course of 6 weeks in the summer of 1952, working alone except for occasional help from friends who were curious about the strange project. He made mistakes, Harold admitted. The first time he lit a fire, smoke came billowing back into the house because he'd miscalculated the draft. He had to partially dismantle the upper section and rebuild it with different angles. But he figured it out, and once it was working properly, it never failed. Not in 62 years. Susan had been taking notes on a legal pad, filling page after page with sketches and calculations. "The thermal mass concept could be adapted," she said thoughtfully. "Even if we can't build these elaborate masonry structures quickly, we could create temporary heat storage systems. Water barrels positioned around wood stoves, for instance. The water would absorb heat during the day and radiate it back at night. It's not as efficient as this, but it's better than letting all that heat escape." The brainstorming session had lasted for hours, and by the time the group finally left Harold's house, they had the beginnings of a plan, not a solution to the current crisis, which would simply have to be endured with the resources they had, but a framework for building resilience into the community for the future. Over the next week, as the polar vortex finally began to release its grip on the Midwest and power was gradually restored to Hickory Ridge, Harold's house became an unofficial education center. People came in small groups to see the masonry heater, to understand how it worked, and to ask questions about self-sufficiency and resilience. Some came out of genuine interest in learning forgotten skills. Others came out of fear, suddenly aware of how fragile their modern conveniences really were. Harold welcomed them all with the same patient generosity, explaining the principles over and over, letting people touch the warm bricks and feel for themselves the steady, reliable heat that had kept him comfortable, while the world outside descended into chaos. He shared copies of the blueprints with anyone who wanted them, knowing that most would never actually build a masonry heater but hoping that some might, that the knowledge wouldn't die with him. The local newspaper, once power was restored and they could publish again, ran a feature story about Harold and his 1947 heating system. The article was picked up by a regional paper, then by a national wire service, and suddenly Harold found himself at the center of a much larger conversation about sustainable living, lost knowledge, and the vulnerability of modern infrastructure. The attention that came with the newspaper articles was something Harold had never wanted and wasn't quite sure how to handle. By February, as the worst of the winter finally loosened its grip and temperatures climbed back to a merely bitter cold instead of dangerously lethal, his phone was ringing constantly. Journalists wanted interviews. Sustainability advocates wanted him to speak at conferences. Preppers and homesteaders wanted detailed construction guides. A production company from California even called asking if he'd be interested in hosting a television show about traditional building techniques. Harold politely declined most of these requests. He was 78 years old, he reminded people, and he had no interest in becoming any kind of public figure. But he did agree to give workshops at the community center in Hickory Ridge, teaching anyone who was interested about the principles of thermal mass heating, sustainable forestry, and the other old-world skills that had served him so well during the crisis. The first workshop drew 43 people, far more than anyone had expected. They sat in folding chairs in the drafty community center, bundled in coats because the building's heating system was still being repaired, and listened as Harold explained concepts that their great-grandparents would have considered common sense, but that had become exotic knowledge in the modern world. He talked about heat capacity and thermal conductivity, about how different materials absorbed and released heat at different rates. He explained the difference between conductive heat, convective heat, and radiant heat, and why radiant heat from a massive brick structure felt more comfortable than forced air from a furnace blowing at the same temperature. He demonstrated with diagrams how to calculate the sizing of a firebox based on the volume of space you needed to heat, and how to design internal channels that would maximize heat transfer without creating dangerous back pressure. But more than the technical details, Harold talked about philosophy, about the value of understanding the systems that kept you alive, rather than treating them as mysterious black boxes that either worked or didn't. About the importance of building resilience into your life, not out of paranoia or fear, but out of respect for the unpredictable nature of the world. About the satisfaction that came from working with your hands, from creating something solid and permanent that would outlast you and serve future generations. My father-in-law built that heater 72 years ago, Harold told the assembled crowd. He's been gone for 30 years now, but his work still keeps me warm every winter. That's legacy, that's craftsmanship. In a world where most things are designed to be replaced every few years, where planned obsolescence is built into nearly every product, there's something powerful about creating something that lasts. Among the attendees was a young couple, Michael and Jennifer Torres, who'd moved to Hickory Ridge just 2 years earlier. They'd bought an old farmhouse on the south edge of town, attracted by the low property prices and the dream of a simpler life away from the city. The polar vortex had shaken them badly. They'd spent 3 days huddled in their bedroom with a small space heater running off a generator, burning through their savings on gasoline, terrified that they'd made a terrible mistake leaving Chicago. After the workshop, they'd approached Harold with a proposition. They wanted to build a masonry heater in their farmhouse, and they wanted to document the entire process on video to share with others who might be interested in doing the same. They weren't looking to profit from it, Jennifer explained. She was a graphic designer who could work remotely, and Michael was a freelance carpenter. They simply believed that this knowledge needed to be preserved and shared more widely, and they were willing to invest their time and money to make it happen. Harold had been skeptical at first. The last thing he wanted was to be turned into some kind of internet sensation. His life turned into content for people to consume between cat videos and political arguments. But the Torres couple were earnest and respectful, and their farmhouse was structurally similar to his own, making it a good candidate for a masonry heater installation. If we do this, Harold said carefully, we do it right. No shortcuts, no rushing to meet some filming schedule. We build it the way it should be built, and if that takes 3 months instead of 3 weeks, that's what it takes. And we stop immediately if I think what we're doing is unsafe or structurally unsound. They'd agreed to his terms without hesitation, and in March, as the snow finally began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared in the muddy fields around Hickory Ridge, the project began. Frank Kowalski came out of retirement to oversee the masonry work, his aged hands steadier than they had any right to be. Robert Chen donated his time as general contractor, coordinating the foundation work and making sure everything met modern building codes even while incorporating a design from 1947. Susan Martinez came by regularly to help with calculations and problem-solving when they encountered unexpected challenges. The first step was the foundation. A masonry heater, with its 2 tons of brick and stone, required serious structural support. They had to reinforce the floor joists in the Torres farmhouse and pour a concrete pad that would distribute the weight properly. This alone took 2 weeks, and Harold insisted they wait an additional week for the concrete to fully cure before proceeding. The actual construction of the heater was a masterclass in traditional masonry technique. Frank laid each brick with the precision of a surgeon, checking and rechecking his levels, making sure the internal channels were exactly the right dimensions. He mixed his own refractory mortar, adjusting the proportions based on the specific materials they'd managed to source. When they couldn't find the exact type of fire brick specified in the original plans, he spent an entire afternoon researching alternatives and calculating thermal expansion coefficients to make sure the substitution would work. Harold was there every day, not doing the physical labor himself, but serving as the keeper of the knowledge, the living link to the Finnish engineer who'd drawn up those plans in 1947, and to the German immigrant who'd built the first heater back in 1952. He told stories about his father-in-law, about the Depression-era mindset that valued durability and self-sufficiency above convenience, about the gradual erosion of practical skills as America embraced modern technology. Jennifer filmed everything, but she also put down the camera regularly to ask questions, to learn, to understand not just what they were doing but why. Michael took detailed notes, creating his own annotated version of the blueprints with modern measurements and material specifications that would be easier for contemporary builders to follow. The community followed the project with intense interest. People stopped by regularly to watch the progress, to ask questions, to offer encouragement. Some brought food for the work crew, others donated materials or tools. The Torres farmhouse became a gathering place, a symbol of something deeper than just an alternative heating system. It represented a reconnection with knowledge that had been nearly lost, a rejection of the assumption that newer was always better, and a recognition that resilience required more than just having a backup generator and a pantry full of canned goods. By late April, the masonry heater was complete. It stood 8 feet tall and nearly 10 feet wide, a monument to patient craftsmanship in an age of instant gratification. The brickwork was beautiful, each course perfectly level, the joints crisp and clean. The firebox door was a piece of ironwork that Frank had commissioned from a local metalworker, designed to match the aesthetic of the original 1947 plans. They waited another week for the mortar to fully cure, and then came the moment of truth. With a crowd of perhaps 30 people gathered in the Torres living room, Harold himself lit the first fire. He'd brought seasoned oak from his own woodpile, split to exactly the right size, dried to exactly the right moisture content. He built the fire the way his father-in-law had taught him 6 decades ago, with kindling arranged in a specific pattern to ensure maximum airflow and complete combustion. The fire caught quickly, flames roaring up through the carefully designed channels. Everyone held their breath, watching the chimney, waiting to see if smoke would come billowing back into the house the way it had during his father-in-law's first attempt. But Frank had learned from those early mistakes, had incorporated the corrections that 70 years of accumulated knowledge had refined. The draft was perfect. The smoke disappeared up the chimney, and within minutes, the bricks began to warm. Harold stood back, his hand resting on Michael's shoulder, and watched as another generation learned what he had always known. That the old ways weren't backward, they weren't primitive or obsolete. They were tested, refined, proven through decades and centuries of human experience. And in a world growing increasingly complex and fragile, increasingly dependent on systems that most people didn't understand and couldn't repair, there was profound value in simplicity, in mass and fire, in brick and stone, in knowledge passed down through generations, preserved not in digital files or cloud storage, but in human memory and human hands. The fire burned hot and clean for 2 hours, then died down to coals. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave, sensing they'd witnessed something significant. By evening, the bricks were still warm. By morning, the Torres couple reported their entire house had stayed comfortable through the night, even though the temperature outside had dropped into the 30s. The video series that Jennifer and Michael eventually posted online wouldn't go viral in any conventional sense. It wouldn't get millions of views or make them famous, but it would reach the people who needed to see it. People across the country and around the world who were quietly questioning the wisdom of total dependence on modern infrastructure, who were looking for alternatives that offered real resilience rather than just the illusion of security. And in Hickory Ridge, as spring turned to summer and the memory of that brutal winter began to fade into community legend, 3 more families began planning their own masonry heaters. The knowledge that had nearly been lost was taking root again, spreading through human connection and shared purpose, ensuring that the next time the power failed, the gas ran out, and the modern world showed its fragility, a few more people would be ready. Not because they'd hoarded supplies or built bunkers, but because they'd learned the simple, ancient truth that Harold Jameson had known all along. That warmth, like so many essential things in life, comes not from complexity, but from understanding. Not from dependence, but from knowledge. And not from what you buy, but from what you build with your own hands and pass on to those who come after.